Hi students, it's Dr. Newmark here. This is our first highlights video for graduate students in English 512. So this week for our theoretical or scholarly literature content, we have just one piece by Claire Lauer and Ava Brumberger, and we're going to jump right into talking about it now. Okay, so Lauer and Brumberger in their article, Technical Communication as User Experience, in a broadening industry landscape are basically arguing for the leveraging of existing technical communication practitioner skills into the UX landscape. So this is something that I'm really interested in fostering through a class like this. As they argue throughout the article, primarily in its conclusion, there are many skills that are fundamental to the study of technical communication and to the practice of technical communication that are necessarily appropriate in the UX field, which is blossoming, ever growing, and is quite remunerative for people who work in that field. So let's jump into some of the content from the article. So I would ask you, and as I will in many of these highlights videos, I'm going to ask you a few questions on topics that were raised in the article that I want you to think a little bit more about. So how is user experience a richer and more inclusive approach than usability? And what does this mean? So usability is one thing, and user experience by its nature, having two words together and how it's been used more frequently in the last decade, means something else. So I want you to think about that and be able to answer that question. So the authors have a premise that the work that technical communicators do is vital to UX work, and I would agree with them. But that interweaving is not often obvious or explicit to people in UX. So what do you think of this claim from what you know about technical and professional communication? Some of you know more about it than others, but how would you imagine that technical communicators could be vital to UX teams? So from what you've read, how is the modern day field of UX, user experience, interdisciplinary? And what are some of the disciplines that shape it? Certainly human factors engineering, social science, psychology, communication, technical and professional communication, computer science, software development. These are many different disciplines, so to speak, but the way that they come together to undergird what we know now as the fertile territory of UX is interesting to think about. And when we get further on into the article, you'll see that UX itself is not a degree. Like, you can get a certification in UX, and there are many online courses that would allow you to get that kind of certification, but it is less common in a university setting. It's more of an amalgam of skills that people sometimes assemble throughout their early career or even in a mid-career transition. So I don't know whether I'm playing devil's advocate here, but I think it's important to sort of push against the grain, even in a class that is about usability and user experience. I want to ask you, so how convinced are you, because of our training as TPC folks and audience analysis and our capacity to always attend to users' needs, how convinced are you that technical communicators are as important to UX teams as programmers, psychologists, and graphic designers? So you think about all the user interfaces that you engage with, let's say, web interfaces or mobile app interfaces. Think about how vital you think it is for a technical communicator to have been in the mix in the development process. Is that obvious to you? Can you think about such scenarios where the skill sets that we possess could be contributive to that eventual customer-facing output? I just want you to sort of think through that question. So to determine which job listings were viable for their study, the authors excluded job listings that did not include rhetorical work. Some of you have studied rhetoric more than others, but what do you understand by the term rhetorical work? And think about that in relation to how they discern their sample population of job advertisements. So consider the author's description of intermediary products that support the development of a final deliverable. So review these products. What kinds of things would communicators or other folks who maybe don't necessarily have a background in writing and communication, what kinds of intermediary products are they producing between the initial concept or the early iteration of an output and the ultimate customer-facing output, the item that was launched, for example, an ultimate fully fledged website. So what kinds of perhaps written, textual, visual communication, documentation outputs are part of that arc from point A to point B? So how familiar with these genres and outputs are you? Go back into the article, and I did put a page citation there, 255, and take a look at those outputs and think to yourself, well, how familiar am I? And if I were in a workplace context working with the UX team, how comfortable would I be participating in the creation of some of these outputs? So in the realm of general review of their article, how do you react to Lauer and Brumberger's choices of data visualization? They have lots of different figures in this article. Do you think they contributed to your overall understanding of their message? I just sort of want to push against this from a design perspective. Those of you who are in a master's or PhD program in rhetoric and writing, eventually you'll probably be writing and publishing scholarly articles yourself. So if you've done this kind of research that focuses on the sort of data analysis that they did, do you think that their choices for figures, their way of synthesizing that data visually, was effective for you? Did it help you to better understand their argument? With you as the user of their content, did that help you, those choices that they made? So Lauer and Brumberger classify traditional technical communication jobs as information developer jobs. So in contrast to UX jobs, so these ID jobs compare poorly to UX jobs in the realm of salary. So also UX jobs seem to be less dependent on the applicant's education credentials and more dependent on an applicant submitting a portfolio of work. That's one of Lauer and Brumberger's takeaways at the end of this video, is that to help TPC folks make the transition into UX, we really need to help them prepare a portfolio of materials during their education career. So while the technological aptitudes for UX professionals and ID professionals vary, there's significant overlap, as shown in the author's Venn diagram. So they refer to these aspects of overlap as core competencies. If you took any of my undergraduate classes that comprised our minor or certificate, at that stage, we talked a lot about the competencies in the technical and professional communication field. So the authors argue that these competencies across UX and technical and professional communication are very much alike. And thus, TPC folks are well positioned to adopt central roles in UX. They can argue that they're well positioned to do so. This article is a few years old now. I'm just wondering how much folks like me have taken up that challenge to help push for the actualization in the workplace of those skills that TPC folks possess and learn in their careers and in their academic settings. So how can technical communicators then make the case to UX employers that they are a good fit? Like, let's say you got a degree in tech comm and you wanted to get a job as a UX researcher or some other role on a UX team. How would you make that case? What do the authors say about foregrounding TPC practitioner skills in audience analysis and research? And this kind of rhetorical work, they definitely argue that this is what lies at the heart of UX. So it's basically almost that the TPC applicant is charged with convincing their employer to re-envision what UX is, basically to do public relations on the fact, on the subject that what UX is at its heart is rhetorical. And I would very much agree with that. User experience is really what we're all about in the creation of the kind of content that we're responsible for in TPC. So how would one argue, as I have tried to do a little bit in this video, how would one argue, perhaps how would you argue, for the vital relationship between design and content? So I've given you almost 10 minutes on this article today and a lot to think about. So I do hope you've enjoyed our first weekly highlights for 512, and I hope you watched the undergraduate video as well, the week one highlights video from English 319, as it covers some of the textbook readings from your other required reading for the week. So on that note, I will see you in next week's highlights video.